Hello, a hypothetical world, asexualism. And the point of this world, the motivation of it, is to find a solution for the problems of sexuality, or the problems with sexuality, rather, because sexuality is not, in and of itself, a problem. There's a bunch of solutions, and judging from the name, you could already guess, the most extreme solution is to abolish sexuality completely. Now, I just want to point out here that please do not assume that you understand what I'm actually endorsing here, because I'm not endorsing any of these worlds necessarily. I'm just contemplating their merits, which is a useful exercise. I'm a tourist of extremism, not a denizen of it. Anyway, the thing with sexuality is that it's a complicated matter. And by sexuality, I mean, everything related to sexuality insofar as the way people talk, the way they interact, and romance, all that stuff. Right? Presumably, you can have interactions with people that have nothing to do with any of that. Or at least they're not directly related to any of that. And so it's permissible that that in and of itself doesn't necessarily need to be present for an experiencing, feeling being to experience things. Again, let's take biological constraints out of the picture for a second, because we can, we can slowly but surely remove them with technology. So then we have this opportunity. Now, this is going to seem very, I guess, there's an obvious criticism that you can levy towards anybody who even considers an idea like this, and it's just like, oh, you just need to go get laid. And that is a fair criticism. So we'll get to it. But the point is, you have a thing where, like, there's a real sort of, like, Darwinian free market element to sexuality, obviously, more so than anything else. In other places, it's in the market otherwise, it manifests in sort of the greatest and the worst ways. Now, I would say that I'm a romantic, actually. I think, romance, when it's great, it's lovely, but when it's awful, it's pretty bad. It's no wonder that the amount of like historical anguish and wars and art and all this shit that's been created as a result of people complaining about sexuality-related things and romance-related things. Right, and this does, of course, sort of gravitate, closely to that Schopenhauerian thing of like, oh, romance is evil because fuck you. I, of course, don't like or agree with Schopenhauer, but this does sort of this world is still characterized by kind of asceticism, just like the other ones that I talked about in the past few videos. Is we're talking about removing a significant aspect of human experience. Now, you can remove it. Obviously, if you're removing it for the sake of something greater than it, which I imagine does exist. Even with completely sterile beings, things like contemplation and science and art, these things can still be present. Sexuality is simply an element that you can take out of those things. And the reason, at the very least, at the very least, we should acknowledge that it's possible to take it out of those things. Because aromantic people, I'm not actually sure if aromantic people exist, but they could exist. Asexual people exist. And frankly, there's all kinds of subject matters and things that can happen, that people can do, that have nothing to do with sexuality. So it's totally permissible that this is removable. Now, you might ask the question, well, why should we remove it? What actual urge is there to drive into this direction for any reason? Well, the obvious. It's that all the suffering that exists as a result of things like sexuality and romance and all that stuff. I mean, you could just look at psychotic examples, people like Elliot Rodger and stuff like that, and And even more generally than that, it's not even just the psychopaths. The general misfortune or the general misery that is accompanied by anyone who goes, sort of romantically, intimately unsatisfied throughout their life. That generates a lot of possibly unnecessary torture. And so this, that is the primary reason to drive into this direction. Now, of course, there's all kinds of other possible solutions, which I'm going to talk about first. And the actual, the reality where we completely get rid of sexuality. I'm calling that asexualism. I'll get to that, later. But let's first of all go into the other possible things you can do. There's a lot of layers to romance, I guess. There's romance, there's intimacy, there's all kinds of personal fucking emotional bullshit. But then there's just plain sexuality. And I'm going to focus more so on that in this rather than the romantic side, because the romantic side is a bit like, let's say, for example, you can let the free market decide the romantic thing, but the sexuality thing, that is something you can amend in a way. This is kind of an interesting topic. I've wanted to discuss it. In a weird way, I really like discussing it because it's something that's very relevant to everyone in a way. The fact of the matter is, you have people who are attractive and unattractive, and the obvious solution is to just make everybody attractive. If you have a way of doing that, and attractive not with... See, that's the thing. Then the obvious question is like, well, what counts as attractive? What counts as attractive? There's a general sort of... It's vague, but there's a general notion of attractiveness that permeates the system right now. And it has to do with how people look, and, part of it might be style and the things that are cultural and change over time, blah, 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 blah. Other parts of it might have to do with things like height or, general look and, presence of certain physical assets, etc. These are the things that we can actually select for ourselves with genetic engineering. So if we have genetic engineering, we could effectively alter the way new people are created so that, if you look at that 10-point scale of attractiveness, everybody's at least a 7. And then, if you do that, you allow for the individualistic element of attractiveness and romance to play more of a role. Then it becomes more about personality and swagger and a person's style and their way of doing things and their aura, rather than just plain physical attractiveness, because that in and of itself could be a huge hamper, and that's not something that's very easy to change. That's why some people put all this money into plastic surgery, because it's not easy to change. And guaranteed, I could almost guarantee that as soon as the technology is available to make people as attractive as they want to be, and it's cheap, it's going to happen all over the place. So you might as well contemplate that possibility. Now, a question here that pops into my mind that's pretty important is the 10-point scale, which is a pretty rough scale, and it's by no means scientific, but is that 10-point scale relative or absolute? In the sense that if the 10-point scale is relative and you make everybody at the very least a 7, then 7 becomes the new 1. And now all you've really done is you've shrunk down the scale by making everybody look more similar to each other, because supposedly 7s, people that are 7, 8, 9, and 10 have more have similar attributes compared to people who are lower on the scale. So once you shrink down the scale to 7 to 10, you don't actually change anything, because our perception of attractiveness has to do with sort of class and it has to do with which percentile you're in rather than how attractive you are in absolute terms. Which means a 7 who is a 7 on a 10-point scale we think of as a 7, but a 7 who is now at the lowest end we think of as a 1. It doesn't matter that they're as attractive. We might think of that as it's still the least attractive person ever. Basically, there's a kind of like hedonic treadmill thing to this. It's like no matter how much we shrink the scale, people are always going to vie for the most attractive person no matter what. It doesn't matter what you actually do. The most attractive cast, whether it's a tiny percentage of people or not, are always going to be the most preferred, and they're going to be more preferred, and they're going to be preferred just as much compared to, you know, the people at the lowest end, regardless of how much we shrink the scale. That's the idea here. You know, so the sort of the impact of having all people being reasonably attractive is meaningless, because we only value attractive and it is based on how it looks relative to unattractiveness. That's the idea. I think that's bullshit, of course. That's a possibility, but I think that's wrong. Simply by virtue of the fact, you know, if I'm in a room full of attractive people, I'm not going to, you know, even the least attractive person within that room is still attractive. And you could think, well, that's because I'm living in the context of a world where there's unattractive people outside this room. Okay, maybe, but I doubt it, because I think it's more ingrained to our, like, biology. You know, we find people that look like us, we might find more attractive. People that have general, you know, nice human features we find attractive. We're not going to find, you know, animals and things that look further and further from human attractive. So the less, the more departed, the point is that it's like there's an absolute scale of attractiveness, basically. You know, not taking into account subjectivity and culture and all that shit, but just in terms of, like, biology, it seems like there is an absolute scale of attractiveness. And if there is, then you can easily compress everything down to 7, 8, 9, and 10. And the reason I say 7, 8, 9, and 10, because that seems like the margin where subjectivity plays a high role. You know, you could show, I can show, I mean, in terms of just like have these conversations, I've shown people that I thought were 10s to friends of mine, and they thought, oh, well, I don't think that person's that attractive. There might be an 8 or a 7. And it's like, so, you know, there's a 10-point scale, but we disagree about what value somebody has on that scale. They might have a value that's higher or lower, depending on some kind of subjective preference, right? But the whole point that there's an absolute element to it, that seems perfectly fair. If we take away, you know, if we, it's basically just the argument then that let's just get rid of ugly people, and not in the sense that we don't let them breed, we just genetically engineer their kids to not be ugly like they are. Which sounds really harsh when I say it, but that's just because of how I'm saying it. I don't actually mean offense to anyone when I'm decrying this. This would also probably be the best option in terms of fixing the problem with sexuality. This would be my preferred option, is simply using some sort of genetic engineering tech to make it easier for people to have the body that they want. Because we're talking about simply the look of the body. Everything else has to be part of a competitive sort of Darwinian market system. Everything else has to be earned, because only when it's earned, then it's that's when it sort of feels justified at that point. But the point of it overall is that if we do this, we're not focusing on superficial elements anymore. We're focusing on, you know, we don't have to focus on them because we can just guarantee them via technology. We can guarantee them via genetics. We don't need to worry and compete over them. We can compete over things that are more important, you know, like people's actual choices and their actual preferences and their sort of their you know, the individualism can take a real hold, I guess. The kind of individualism I would value more at the very least. It doesn't. The fact of the matter is, competing, you know, competing just in terms of raw physical attractiveness doesn't feel very meaningful. You know, the result, you know, competing for someone's affection in terms of, like, you know, something else, some kind of, you know, charm or some kind of behavior or some sort of intelligence or any kind of other attribute that you sort of use, that seems more meaningful than just attractiveness, because raw attractiveness is plainly physical. We have very little control over it, and that's why it doesn't really feel like a fair fight. So, but yeah, just thinking about the whole relative to absolute thing, you know, that's why I'm not a big fan of the whole hedonic treadmill idea either. But here especially, it's just like, this isn't really like the hedonic treadmill, but it's similar in the sense that if, you know, it's like, I think that someone who is a 10 is attractive only because I know how they are compared to, like, the ones and zeros. Now, what I think is more likely to happen, if everybody is a 10 or a 7, 8, 9, 10, what's going to happen is people are going to value good looks less, and they're going to value other things more, because they don't have to worry about good looks anymore. And that is what's likely to happen. It's not the case that our actual perception of attractiveness in terms of looks doesn't change. It's that our perception of attractiveness in general changes. Our perception of attractiveness in general, sort of the playing field will change, because people aren't worried about looks anymore, because we're not competing on that level. But it's not the case that, you understand what I'm saying. It's when you compress the scale, we don't think of looks the same way anymore, because everybody has the good looks. So good looks are guaranteed, right? The relative thing would be even if you did that, people would still be worried about looks just as much as they were before, even when everybody looks, 7, everyone's a 7 at least. Well, very unlikely to happen, as my point. I think people aren't going to worry about looks because looks are going to be guaranteed. They're going to worry about something else. They're going to look at, I like that girl's hair. Oh, she's, she has a cool walk. Or, that guy is tall, or he has a nice face. Whatever. You get the point. It becomes about other things that are more subjective, rather than this sort of absolute, concrete attractiveness, visceral attractiveness. Anyway, the other thing that's kind of interesting here is there's another question with all this attractiveness thing, and that sort of lends credence to the idea of abolishing attractiveness, is why we even have to do this. It's like if you make the argument could be phrased in the sense that, like, if you're making everybody attractive, it's like you're justifying superficiality. It's like, look at how people in Hollywood are obsessed with anti-aging shit and plastic surgery and all this crap. It's like, it's like we're trying to defy nature, and it's like we're justifying something very superficial, rather than sort of justifying, rather than emphasizing something less superficial, rather than just emphasizing, forget attractiveness, focus on other things. And this is where it gets interesting, right? Because this comes back to a whole kind of like socialist capitalist argument as well. The reason making everybody attractive it undermines the notion of superficiality, is because it takes it out of the equation. Making everybody attractive makes attractiveness meaningless, because now we don't worry about, or making everybody physically attractive makes physical attractiveness less valuable, all right? Because we have it. It makes it less. It makes it less something that we focus on. We start focusing on other things that aren't related to that, or aren't directly related to that, because it's guaranteed, rather than allowing physical attractiveness to still play a huge role. That is what allows superficiality to still be a focus. Now, you could argue, well, hold on. I'm talking about a world where everybody's attractive. This isn't really asexualism, but it's related to asexualism. I'm talking about a world where everybody's attractive. Why not have a world where everybody's unattractive, where everybody's ugly? Well, again, it depends what we define as ugly and attractive. Right now, attractiveness is like, people who are tall, thin, and symmetry or some shit. I don't know what how to describe it, but it's there. What if unattractiveness was what we should... Like, what about a world where everybody's unattractive? Well, the problem with a world where everybody's unattractive is, by virtue of the fact that they're unattractive, that constantly is going to create misery. And people are constantly going to try to... It's hard to explain, but it's like things are going to tend away from such a world because it's unattractive, by definition. things are going to tend towards attractiveness. By definition, again, people are going to try to make things nicer and better and smoother, etc. Trying to enforce an attractiveness is completely antithetical to just everything. It doesn't make any sense, because the very point of unattractiveness is that it's something we tend away from. People who are unattractive will try to look more attractive. People who are, or they'll try to focus on other things, which also undermines the whole point of the whole value of unattractiveness to begin with. So it's just trying to have a world where everybody's unattractive is just a world where you're punishing people. A world like that doesn't make any sense. A world like that is basically entirely flawed. Now, what you could do is you could make a world where everybody... You could have a world where the notion of attractiveness flips. So what we think of as attractive now becomes unattractive, and what we think of as unattractive now becomes attractive, and that becomes the new sort of standard of attractiveness. So say, like, just like gross, hairy, disgusting-looking people. That could become the new attractive. Well, if that becomes the new attractive, it doesn't matter, basically. It doesn't matter where what the standard is. The only thing that matters is what we actually do in terms of that standard, right? If we make everybody... Remember, the idea of a 10-point scale is the 10 is basically the most attractive kind of person that exists. If the notion of what that is changes, then that's fine, but now the hairy, gross person becomes the new 10, and now 7 to 10 just becomes a new scale that's closer to that rather than closer to what we have now, tall, thin people. So, you can... The idea here is that you can permute and change how you like the actual external physical traits that attractiveness sort of embodies however you like. It doesn't actually change anything from an ethical perspective here, because I'm thinking ethically it makes more sense to have a world where everybody's attractive rather than a world where everybody's unattractive. And I don't actually care what the standard is. Is my point. I don't care what the standard is when we do that, because and of course you could say, well, how do we do that? Well, you change it neurologically. You alter people's brains so that they think something else, so that they think that gross, hairy people are now 10s and they're super attracted to them or something. It doesn't matter how you do it. The point is, it doesn't matter if you do it. Either way, having a system where a system that's full of just 7s, 8s, 9s, and 10s is better than a system that has the whole 10-point scale. That's the point. It doesn't matter what the 10 is, so long as we're all close to the 10, So that's sort of... That's what I mean by solving the problem of sexuality. It's not about... Understand, it's not about solving a problem. What is solving a problem? Solving a problem is never about just removing an obstacle for the sake of removing an obstacle. Because certain obstacles are part of the process. They're what make the actual journey worth it. They're what make everything feel meaningful. The problem isn't the existence of obstacles. The problem is the existence of obstacles that aren't fair. And I know what that fairness, what it means for an obstacle to be unfair is quite vague and subjective, and people disagree about it all the time, but that is what it comes down to. It comes down to a thing that's in the way of our progress that just isn't good. It just doesn't make sense. It's not necessary. It doesn't add to the experience. It's either superfluous, waste of time, or it's actually uncomfortable and painful. And that is... When I say solving the problems of sexuality, that is what I'm talking about. I'm talking about solving it in that sense. Solving it in the sense of removing things that don't seem fair. It's not fair for someone who is genetically burdened by being just a completely horrific, disgusting looking person. Certainly they can try to overcome that and circumvent that by focusing on other things, and by all means I think they should. There are plenty of things in life that matter outside of physical attractiveness. But my point is, the barrier that physical attractiveness creates for that person to try and to reach their happiness, to reach the kind of the happiness that they want to reach, isn't fair. And that is that is the thing that we're trying to fix here. That is the thing that I'm conceptually trying to fix here, is that exact problem. How do you fix that? How do you fix the problems of sexuality that aren't fair or necessary or just, they're just plain meaningless, at least. They're just plain bad. Now, the more extreme thing you could do is just straight up get rid of sexuality completely. That is the extreme option. A complete asceticism, ascetic option. The Stoic option. The Buddhist option, the Christian, priest option. Complete celibacy. Now, there's a few ways to do this, and this is what I mean. This is thematically in line with the last two videos where I talked about system side. The difference is there in system side we're talking about basically withdrawing from all experiences life has to offer, all possible experiences, because all of the experiences aren't worth it, because all the experiences contain unnecessary suffering, blah blah blah. That's obviously, I've already said my opinion on that. I don't agree with that, but there are obviously some things that do. And the question with sexuality is sexuality as a whole enough of a problem that we should get rid of the entire thing and create a world of asexualism? There's a few ways to create a world of asexualism. One way is to just make everybody celibate. In other words, the physical capacity and the desire for sexual encounter still exists. It's just repressed via cultural means. It's repressed via priests and hymns and sermons and etc. Some sort of cult kind of meme that just takes over and people just stop, having sex. We keep the human species alive with technology and other things. Let's ignore that whole element for a second. I talked about that in system side. It's easy to keep the human species alive technologically. We don't actually need to have intercourse to keep the species alive, in theory, right? So we could do that. This option is very flawed in the sense that it's probably not going to work. Like, if you trying to enforce sexuality, asexualism on people who aren't asexual, who have the desire to be sexual, especially given how embedded it is in society now, it's very hard to pull off. It's not impossible. I'm not going to say it's impossible. I think if you have some sort of like culture of monks that formed and was able to procreate and stay alive in some way, but without actually having sex, and they completely sort of repressed it from their minds and focused on, picking flowers or whatever, you could do that, right? And if that spread and that became the embedded way of things, then that would work. Right now, sexuality is pretty embedded in almost everything. There's no way to get around it. It's literally everywhere. You go on the internet. Just Pornhub. It's like and that's just this raw sexuality. It's not even talking about how sexuality has like seeped into all the other things that we do. Feminists complain about that stuff all the time. So the point is, it's like the whole thing with the vegan, the animals being killed option. It's like, it's so embedded that it's so hard to remove. In order to remove it, you'd have to create technology that could keep the species alive without it. And B, you need to have that cult of celibacy to just take over. The ascetics cult, the Buddhist, priest cult, where they refuse to have sex with anyone, the asexual cult, that cult needs to take over and just cover everyone, and so nobody has sex. It needs to basically win a meme war, a culture war. Very hard to do, very unlikely to happen. I'm not going to say it's impossible in theory. If evolution happened a different way, a world like that might have happened, but it's very unlikely to work. However, there is another way for asexualism to work. And this is, it's related to the other one. It would still require a culture war in our present circumstances. It would still require a kind of revolution and probably a real violent struggle. And it would probably require changing the status quo, obviously. And this option basically requires, getting rid of sex as a concept. Not just everybody's celibate. There's men and women and everyone, and they're still alive, and we still fucking, we grow kids in test tubes or whatever, but we don't have sex. No. This is, we don't have sex as a concept. That means there are no See, this is weird, because we're getting into gender, and then there's the whole non-binary gender thing. There's no physical, there's no genitalia, basically, anymore. A system where there's no genitalia. And all the humans, all the people in it, basically look, you know, like, take, for example, men. Imagine a situation where all the men on Earth, we have this technology to stay alive and create new members of the species, blah, 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 blah. Easy. All right? Let's say all the men, we either destroy all the women, or we take the women and transmute them into, so that they have the same form as a man, but they still look unique to, you know, their fucking genetic code or whatever. So we do that. So there's no feminine features anymore, and then all the men are castrated, so that there's no more male genitalia anymore. And then that becomes the human race. That is essentially what asexualism would look like. It would look like a system without any sexes. It would look like a system without men and women. It would just look without men or women, you know, without this sort of duality of gender and sex. Let's forget non-binary gender, whatever. I'm actually... Good question is what role non-binary gender would even have in such a weird world. But the point is, the whole duality of sex and gender just vanishes. There is no duality anymore. There is just one kind of being. And we reproduce asexually, basically. It's like, imagine a society of cells that reproduced with mitosis. Only it's not cells, it's, you know, humans. It's like that. And there's no genitals, and there's no sex. That would be more thoroughly getting rid of sexuality. And the other option, you don't get rid of the possibility of sex, it's just not practiced because the alternative is embedded in our culture and the way we think. This way, the possibility of it is pretty much destroyed as well, because there is no way to have it. There's no genitals for it anymore. There's no... I mean, people say, like, well, you don't necessarily need genitals to have sex. No, the point is there's no physical stimulation. There's no physical, intimate physical stimulation anymore. You know, no touching, no caressing, no kissing, none of that shit. You get rid of all of it. Not just genitals bouncing together. No kissing, caressing, all of that stuff. All physical intimacy is off the table. All genitalia is off the table. All differences, sort of biological differences in biological sex that would allow for physical intimacy, all of that is removed. You remove that completely. It's not a society of clones, by the way. I would almost go that far. But it's not a society of clones because people still have genetic differences and they look different. And they have different minds and different perspectives and different fucking ways of doing shit. And different personalities. They just don't do any physical intimacy stuff. Imagine a society that is completely sterile in every possible way, full of perfectly sterile, crystalline, serene, sterile beings. That is what asexualism looks like. And that is a wet dream for me. Ironically. No, I'm kidding. I wouldn't actually want such a world. It's a very interesting concept, though, and it's definitely something worth writing about in literature and you know, contemplating the significance of it. It's just interesting to imagine how society would look like if we just stripped sexuality out of all the things that we do. All of the movies, all the romance, all of that stuff. Now, this is where it's also kind of interesting, because we don't actually necessarily need to get rid of sexuality out of, you know, romance out of movies and books and literature and art in asexualism, because in the same way that we study how dolphins and squirrels and other animals have sex and the way they do their shit, we would study and observe and even have art of how other beings live their lives, which would include other beings that happen to have sex. So even in an asexualist world, you could still have the presence of sex as a concept within, as information, sort of contained and held within art and science, obviously. So it's still accessible as a thing, as a theory, as information. It's still accessible. It's just not physical. Nobody within the world practices it. Everybody in the world's perfectly sterile in every way that they do things. It would just be interesting to see what that world would look like. What a world where most interactions that people have are completely sterile. What is that actually like? It's a very interesting concept. In a way, there's obvious positives. There's a lot that we could get done. There's a lot of things that we might focus on, and there's probably a lot to be gained. If we're not focusing on sexuality, what are we focusing on? Now that there's all this room for experiential room, now that sexuality is out of the picture, what fills that experiential room? What other experiences do people have in this kind of situation? Very interesting. I, of course, don't think that we should have such a world, simply due to the fact that it's a huge complexity limitation to have such a world and to try and enforce it. The thing with sexuality, which is why I favor the earlier solution that I mentioned of just making everybody attractive and then having people do, other non-attractiveness related things, is that the issue isn't that sexuality exists, it's the over-reliance on it. And it's the over-reliance on the primitive aspects of sexuality. The way people look, and how fit they are, and how good that is for the gene, and all that shit. We've transcended a lot of that. So those challenges don't matter anymore. They don't need to continue to be. We can abolish them, get rid of them, and move on to the next level. And that's what I think that is actually about. So I don't really... that makes more sense. But the point is that sexuality is still accessible. Sexuality is still present. Hence, it's... the complexity of experiences that are allowed by sexuality is still sort of allowable. It's still permissible. And that's an important thing. Of course, granted, in the asexualist world I described, because you have sexuality in art, you can still have... sexuality is still sort of preserved in a sense, because it's still contained within art. We don't have to get there anytime soon, though. We don't even have to get there at all. My point is, it should still be contained within something, simply because sexuality... There are positives to that experience. There are immense positives to that experience. And the whole point is that we're trying to conserve the positives, trying to just get rid of the negatives, and get rid of the negatives that don't matter. Get rid of the negatives that just get in the way and don't really contribute to the sensation of the positive. That's the goal, right? So my actual endorsement would be, at most, would be the first thing I mentioned, which is just use genetic engineering to make people look, nice and attractive. Or have some sort of, plastic surgery that's really technologically advanced that makes people look nice and attractive. And just make it cheap so that everybody could be nice and attractive. Thus, you fix the whole problem without any, without going too far, without abolishing anything, without going... full system-size Schopenhauerian nut job on this thing. And everything's good. That's the way I see it. But it's a very interesting concept. And albeit, if we actually got rid of sexuality, just imagining that would leave an enormous vacuum of experiences that now have to be filled by something else. And I don't see a way of doing that, of filling that hole. Ironically, filling the hole. I don't see a way of filling the hole left by the absence of experience without simply just repressing it and forgetting that it ever existed. That would be the mistake. That would be the mistake of asexualism, is if you got rid of sexuality, you simply reduced the complexity of experience, of possible experiences that humans have access to something far smaller and simpler. You don't want to do that. If you want to get rid of it, You have to replace it with something else that's greater. You have to replace it with something else that's even more interesting than sexuality to make the sort of the experiential plane even grander, even more complex rather than less complex. Reducing complexity is always not the way to go. Anyway, that's basically my point. So that's what you would want to avoid in the process of trying to fix the problems of sexuality. But my actual opinion is I just want everybody to be attractive and happy, obviously. Cheers.